Hello everyone, this is Instructor Muriel Howard with Breaking Down Coding Cases for Week 2. This week we will be covering the respiratory system or respiratory coding. The first thing I want to do is bring your attention to the Evolve registration process. If you have not done this already, it would behoove each of you to go onto the Evolve website and register for the Next Step textbook. You should have the 2015 version, but if you don't have the 2015 version, you can still register because the information is basically the same from 2014 to 2015. So here's what the announcement looks like, and that link for step 1 is available, so you can click that link and it will take you to your registration page. And step 2, you will click register for this now, and then step 3, click redeem and check out. It's free to register, so make sure that you will see a redemption code in a little box on the left at the bottom. Step 4, register as a new user or enter your current Evolve username and account in the fields on the top left to add the Next Step resources to your existing account. Now, if you already have an Evolve account, you don't need to create a new one. You will just log in with the same information. Say, for example, you use the Evolve registration process for the language of medicine, or you used it for the insurance handbook for the medical office in previous courses. You can just add your registration for this one, this text, as well as the step-by-step. And the instructions are duplicated inside of your front cover of your textbooks. Step 5, click the box for yes, accept the registration agreement, and step 6, wait for your confirmation. Basically, check your email because they will send you a confirmation immediately. And here's the website as well, so you can write it down and make sure you have this close to your fingertips and add it to your favorites. Okay, so here's a sneak peek or an up-close review of the respiratory anatomy. And I always say it's always important to have the organ system in front of you, either displayed like this on your computer screen or in one of your chapters in your textbook, The Language of Medicine, or from a website. And inside of student materials, you should see a link for the respiratory anatomy, which will take you to another website which gives you full details about the entire organ system. So I will reference back and forth to this as I complete the breaking down coding cases for some of the cases. Today I will be covering 2 cases. I will not provide the answers, but I will definitely give you hints and tips on how to find them, and you shouldn't have any problems. Okay, now so let's code. And here's my favorite little motivational picture that I post a lot in the courses. You may run into this little guy a little bit later on, and he's just basically motivating us, saying, hey, we can do it, and let's try to do this today. Okay, so here we are with our first case that we're going to cover today. Now, this case may or may not appear on your test. We have a couple of test banks that we're pulling from. However, once I walk you through coding this particular scenario, you should be fine with all of the other cases, and I will make sure that I will provide hints and tips to make sure that you understand how to code this portion of or this particular section of coding, or the branch of coding, as far as surgery and respiratory. Okay, so as usual, we have our steps inside of our test that's duplicated on top of each question. I just copied them over here so that you guys can see each of the steps for ICD-9 and correct CPT coding. So that's just something that I put in here. It's not really important to what we're coding right now. But I have my preoperative and postoperative diagnosis for the first case, and this is a really short and simple, straightforward case. It seems that way. But as we go through the case, we're going to see that we're missing some of the headings. We're missing the short title to the procedure. We're missing the indications. We don't have the conclusion portion. But this is just a general note or description of the procedure and the diagnosis for it. So the first thing I'm going to cover is the procedure portion, and that's because it's more simple and I want to make sure you guys understand it clearly. We don't have the actual title of the procedure, and that's okay. Once we read through, and this is one case we do have to read through, we're going to be able to pinpoint exactly what the provider did. So he made an incision in the low, or an incision is made low in the neck. Tells us that the trachea is identified in the middle and an opening is created to allow for the new breathing passage. So basically it tells us that the provider did create an opening in the trachea. If this word were not in our case, then we would just refer back to our medical terminology, and I broke this word down in that format. So technically he did creating an opening, which is an ostomy, to cut and create an opening inside of the trachea. So this procedure is simple. He did a tracheostomy, and it tells us that tube is inserted and secured with sutures. Now, even though he did put in the tube, that's all inclusive with the tracheostomy procedure. So the only thing we would have to do is code for tracheostomy. And if you've been paying attention to the regular week 2 lecture, you'll notice that there are multiple types of tracheostomies. One for the age of a patient under 5. And the age in this particular patient, or this case, has not been given, so we are going to code according to an adult, which is older than age 5. And then there's also the planned or emergency. Since we did not see any documentation showing that the provider did this procedure on an emergency basis, we're going to code this as planned. So if it is not documented, it did not happen. So we do not have the age of the patient. If the provider work with us on a day-to-day basis, then we can ask him. But since we're coding from this case, we're not going to add the fact that, or add details for an emergency if it's not provided. An emergency tracheostomy costs more. Okay, so now let's cover our diagnosis. The patient had this tracheostomy because he has a malignant neoplasm of the glottis. That's pretty simple, right? We just go to the neoplasm table, okay? And then from there, we go over alphabetically to the body part, the site, which is glottis. And I'm going to highlight as I go through. Step 1, I'll do yellow. Step 2, body portion is green. And you know, we always find the neoplasm table inside of volume 2 of our ICD-9 manual. We always begin there, and it's towards the end of volume 2. And then we have, finally, we have to choose a column. And so one thing that you learned in your BC3030 course about coding for neoplasms is that you have 6 columns of information. I was about to say 5. We have 6 columns of information to choose from to assure that we pick the proper code. The first column is primary, which is the first origin or site that the neoplasm has been identified. The second column is secondary, which means that this is a reoccurrence or an additional site or a follow-up site after the primary site has been identified. Then we have cancer in situ, which means that this is the only site and it has been sustained in that one position and it has not moved. And then we have benign, Neoplasms are new growths on the skin, so every neoplasm is not cancerous. It's just a lesion or a new growth, a new foreign body of skin that doesn't belong there. That's why it's considered neo, which is new, plasm, which is skin or growth or tissue. So we can have it benign, or we can have uncertain behavior, and we can have unspecified. The unspecified column is if we are not given the details as to whether it is malignant or benign in the case. But since we do have the details about malignant, we're going to code it from the primary malignant column. The reason why we're going to code it as primary is because we do not have details telling us that this is a recurrent neoplasm, which may usually show up in your postoperative diagnosis, recurrent neoplasm or recurrent tumor. So we don't see that word recurrent. We don't see the word metastatic, which means that it has spread, and we don't see secondary neoplasm. So all of those words will indicate that it would be secondary, but since it's not there, we code it as primary. And when we get over to the neoplasm table, it's always important to get your code from your column, which is your primary column, and I am not going to quote that column for this case or the code that you find because it's a really easy code. But I always want you guys to cross-reference it with Volume 1. Volume 1 provides additional details, some additional rules, and you're going to see how that looks when we go to our next case. So I'm going to cross-reference our next neoplasm case. That's why I chose 2 of them. Okay, so this case is complete. We're going to code for tracheostomy planned older than 5, and we don't need to add any additional modifiers or anything like that because everything is straightforward. And then we're going to code for the neoplasm of the glottis, primary malignant column. And that's that. Okay, so now we're going to go over to, and then what I did, let me bring this down here. What I have here is I just pasted a couple of images of my respiratory system, and I want to always have this close by me so that I can look at the case, come back and look at the body parts and pinpoint exactly what's going on. Okay, so for this one we are going to deal with the procedure portion first. It's only given us the fact that they did a bronchoscopy in this case. And what we have to do in these particular cases, because it has not given us any other columns or headings, is read the description of the procedure. So the short description is that it's a bronchoscopy, but as you get more familiar in code, more bronchoscopies, you guys are going to see that there are multiple types. So that's why we have to read this case or some of the details in the case to determine the type. Okay, so it tells us that the patient was anesthetized by the nostrils with 4% lidocaine and lidocaine jelly and ceticaine spray. All of these different types of anesthesia mentioned here are local anesthesia. These particular types of anesthesia are included with the service. So you know that we do have 2 procedure codes down here that we're coding for, but anesthesia will not be one of them. So I should not see any coding specific to anesthesia on any of your answers because that's all inclusive. And I believe you guys learned that with your BC3030 course, one of your assignments, regarding which anesthesia is included with the surgery. Okay, so the next sentence is telling us the details. Remember, the procedural details. Everything that he used. So his equipment is the Olympus PF fiber optic bronchoscope. So he pretty much did a closed procedure. He used a bronchoscope, and let me go to my CPT, because when I reference, I want you guys to be able to go to the right page. So let me get that open right quick. Excuse all the fumbling around. I had left off on ICD-9. Okay, so bronchoscopy. There is a tube that is inserted through the nose. Let's go through here. And I don't have my little highlighter, or do I? I don't like to draw with this thing. Okay, so the tube that is inserted through the nose comes all the way down through the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, and then we have our bronchus. And the bronchus branches off into the left lung and the right lung. And then as we see here, as it branches off, it further branches into multiple lobes. So let's talk about the anatomy right quick. We have our upper lobe, middle lobe, and lower lobe on each lung. So the lung is divided into segments. That's why you see them called lobes, because anything that's segmented in our body is considered a lobe, just like the brain is divided into lobes, the frontal lobe, and so forth and so on. So that's why it's important to know what we're coding and what it looks like. Okay, so now that I've covered that, what he did was he took the bronchus and he stuck it through the nose, and he reviewed the entire tracheobronchial tree, what we just looked at, and the major airways, which is the esophagus, the trachea, epiglottis, all of that. Tells us that no abnormalities were noted on the left side. Okay, so that's fine. Now, he did say that there were extrinsic compression of the posterior segment of the right upper lobe. Let's look at that again. Right upper lobe. So let's just say this is the right lobe right here. Upper lobe, posterior is in the back. So the back side. You have the front side and the back side of the lobe of the lung. Okay, so there also appeared to be submucosal tumor involving the bronchus intermedius between the right upper lobe and right middle lobe. So he's noticing some tumors somewhere up in here on the bronchus between the right and the medial. Okay, medial is here, or the lateral medial is here, and then up here. So it's two portions that he's noticing growths or tumors or lesions. And then what he did was he wanted to identify what types of tumors they were and their behavior. So he did multiple washings, brushings, and biopsies from the right upper lobe bronchus. This is one portion, and the bronchus intermedius, and this is the other portion. So he basically did a procedure here, and he did a procedure here on the right side of the bronchus. Two separate procedures. So it says the specimens were sent for cytology and routine pathologies. So these specimens are considered the biopsies. So he did a bronchoscopy, and the bronchoscopy turned into a biopsy of the bronchus. So he viewed the bronchus, and he took some samples. Pretty much that's the short side or the short story to it. Okay, so how do we find this? We go to our CPT index alphabetically to the word bronchoscopy. That's what he did. However, he didn't just do a bronchoscopy, he did a biopsy. And he also did brushings and protected brushings. So what we have here is a couple of code ranges that you will be referenced to when you get to bronchoscopy, indented underneath the word biopsy. Here's your code ranges. Now what you need to do is cross-reference these code ranges inside of the surgery section for the respiratory system. And if you're using a 2015, I hate calling off page numbers because you might be using a 2014 or you might be using a 2016. But in a 2015, my page number is 171. The first thing I see when I get to my page is an example of how the procedure looks when there is a bronchoscope inserted through the nasal cavity and how a bronchoscopy looks. It's giving me a code range that begins with 31622 all the way through 31661. It's letting me know that all of these different types of bronchoscopies can happen by way of a rigid tube. And that's fine. So that's why it's important to know what he did and what type of bronchoscopy was done. So in this type of bronchoscopy, we are referenced to the code ranges for 3162, and I stopped there because 316 code range, 3162 code range represents, well, I'm not going to say it represents, but what I'm going to say is it represents the endoscopic types of bronchoscopies. You have various types of bronchoscopies that can be done with an incision, which are open procedures, but we're dealing with a closed procedure or endoscopic procedure where the patient did not have to physically have surgery or be opened up. He used the nose as an orifice. So I have the word endoscopy, and it's giving me some rules and guidelines right here. We always want to pay attention to that. Here's what it's telling me. It says for endoscopy procedures, which is a scope with a probe on the end that the provider can use to look into any body orifice or cavity. In this particular case, it's known as a bronchoscopy because he ended in the bronchus. But if he had continued all the way down to the abdomen, this particular procedure would no longer be a bronchoscopy, it would be a gastroscopy. So it's used, the same exact equipment is used. The only difference is the probe that they use on the end to get to that particular body part, or where the scope ends. So wherever the scope ends is the actual procedure. If he had stopped at the trachea, then this would be called a tracheoscopy, and so forth and so on. So those are some hints and clues for other coding cases. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to read my note in my instruction. It's telling me for endoscopy procedures, code appropriate endoscopy for each anatomic site examined. Surgical bronchoscopy always includes diagnostic bronchoscopy when performed by the same physician. And it's telling us that codes 31622 through 31651 and 31660 through 31661 also includes fluoroscopic guidance when it is performed. So what I need to know is that I don't need to code separately for fluoroscopic guidance if my code range falls in that category. I also need to know that I'm going to code separately for each anatomic site examined. He basically examined and did a procedure on the right upper lobe of the bronchus and the bronchus intermedius. And pretty much what I need to do is use one of these codes for the right upper brush washings. I hate saying that. Washings or multiple washings. And I also need to use the code for the biopsy. And that's it. So you're going to look down the page and you're going to examine or pay attention to the codes that you're referenced to. So you should have a code for brushings or protected brush washings. You should also have a code for the endobronchial biopsy, single or multiple sites. Now, these codes that you're going to choose are indented under a standalone code. The standalone code includes every procedure that is also rendered in the indented code. So the indented code under, let's say for instance 31622, that's the standalone code. Every code indented underneath 31622 includes all of the services performed inside of that one code 31622. So that just means that you need to pick one or more codes underneath 31622. So, and you don't need to use the actual 31622 code because that's not descriptive enough. And that's another hint that I'm giving you guys. So you should do well this week using this information that I'm sharing with you. So let's move on. Your right side of the body is where the services were rendered, so therefore you need a modifier for that. Additionally, 2 procedures were performed at the same session by the same provider, so you need a modifier for that. So that's just your hints about that. Since I'm not providing the answers, I'll give you hints about the modifier. Now, last but not least, and this is the last thing that we are going to cover in this particular video, is the ICD-9. The patient has carcinoma of the right lung and the bronchus intermedius, and this is what the provider has concluded based on, I guess, the pathology report. And what we do, once again, neoplasm table, and since we are dealing with the lung, we go there. And then what I did is I stopped there because I did neoplasm table and then lung. Then I did 162, which is my 3-digit category. The reason I stopped at 162 for my 3-digit category is because there are multiple locations, there are multiple locations for this particular carcinoma. And I need to reference volume 1 to determine how to code this correctly. So what I have is my volume 1, and what I'm seeing here is the 3-digit category of 162. I see my symbol, which is my big bold red dot, and it's telling me that I need to use an additional digit, but it's telling me here that malignant neoplasm of trachea, bronchus, and lung. Okay, so the patient did have the neoplasm of the bronchus and also a segment of the lung. It's telling me here that this excludes carcinoma, carcinoid tumor of the bronchus, which is benign, and it also excludes malignant carcinoid tumor of the bronchus. And what we need to do here is go down and look at the different segments: the trachea, the main bronchus, the upper lobe bronchus or lung, the middle lobe bronchus or lung, the lower lobe bronchus or lung, and then here 162.8 says other parts of the bronchus or lung. And what it's telling me here is that malignant neoplasm of contiguous or overlapping sites of bronchus or lung whose point of origin cannot be determined. So we can't say that it is a primary neoplasm or a secondary neoplasm. We don't know which site began first. So we don't know the point of origin for whether or not it's the bronchus or the lung or the bronchial branch. So that's what contiguous means, that they're overlapping sites in the same organ system. So this would be the best code of choice, 162.8, since we do not want to code for multiple sites in the bronchus, and we don't know if we're going to code one is primary and one is secondary, because we do have 2 portions of the bronchus that's affected by this particular carcinoma. So I just wanted to make sure that you guys are aware of that. Pay attention to your your volume 1 for additional instructions. And I think that is it for the day. And I am so glad that you guys were able to join me or review this video. I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at my email in the course room or my cell phone 805-824-0065. You can call and text. Have a great day.